During my presentation yesterday, I quoted the inaugural homily of Pope Benedict XVI. You might remember that. We are not some casual and meaningless product of evolution. Each of us is a thought of God. Each of us is willed. Each of us is loved. That homily is hands down my favorite thing that Joseph Ratzinger ever wrote. Not just because it was this incredible moment where one of my favorite theologians became the Pope. And one reason I love it is because those of you who haven't ever read it, in it, the Pope finally asked and answered a very public forum, although he was speaking in Italian, asked and answered a question that I imagine millions of Catholics would love to have answered. Indeed, I don't know any Catholics who not only would love to hear the answer to that he gave, but have actually had the question itself. Right? So, one of the things that he does, the chief part of the homily, is about explaining the various symbols related to the papacy. And he sets the stage, see here, oh, there it is. He set the stage by referring to the pallium, which is this here, woven in pure wool on his shoulders, that had been set upon the shoulders of every pope since the 4th century. And he explained that the pallium refers to the participation of the Bishop of Rome in the ministry of Jesus the Good Shepherd. He said the wool represents, quote, the lost, sick, or weak sheep which the shepherd places on his shoulders and carries to the waters of life. That is, it represents all of us and all of humanity, lost in the desert of sin and alienation and meaninglessness. But then he offers a heroic image of Jesus the Good Shepherd. After describing humanity in this wretched condition, he says, the Son of God will not let this happen. He cannot abandon humanity in so wretched a condition. He leaps to his feet and abandons the glory of heaven in order to go in search of the sheep and pursue it all the way to the cross. He takes it upon his shoulders and he carries our humanity. He carries us all. He is the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. And then he made a contrast, kind of a chilling contrast, with the original ancient meaning of the king as a shepherd in the ancient Near East, and shows how God's self-revelation in Christ gives the idea of a shepherd a surprising new meaning. He said in the ancient Near East, it was customary for kings to style themselves shepherds of their people. This was an image of their power, a cynical image. To them, their subjects were like sheep, which the shepherd could dispose of as he wished. When the shepherd of all humanity, the living God, himself became a lamb, he stood on the side of the lambs with those who were downtrodden and killed. This is how he reveals himself to be the true shepherd. I am the good shepherd. I lay down my life for the sheep, Jesus says of himself. And then, and this should be quite reminiscent from last night's presentation, it is not power, but love that redeems us. This is God's sign. He himself is love. And then he raises the question I've been talking about here in the form of a hope all of us have had at one time or another. So here we get to the crux. How often, he immediately says after that quote, how often we wish that God would show himself stronger, that he would strike decisively, defeating an evil and creating a better world. And I was like, here it is. Here, the greatest Catholic theologian of our day will now give the answer to one of my deepest questions, the one that so often haunts me and everyone I know. Why does God not act? Why does he remain silent? Why do the poor cry out and yet seemingly are given no reply? Are not rescued from their oppressors, their murderers, their abusers? For that matter, why must they cry out at all when their innocence and happiness is being shattered by the grotesque trauma of evil? Why does God let it even approach them? Why does he not prevent it? As a father of 2 young children at the time, I had in mind many things. Just 2 months before the Pope's inaugural homily, a beloved younger cousin of mine had hung himself in despair. Of course, I had in mind the horrors of Auschwitz, the victims of serial killers. I had in mind the victims of the terrible tsunami that just months before had killed 230,000 people. Just 4 months after the homily was given, a massive storm, Hurricane Katrina, would rage across the Gulf of Mexico and flood my home and almost entirely destroy my beloved city. And it sent my wife and my 5-year-old daughter and my 3-year-old son into refugee status for a year. And had I known that was coming, that would have been on my mind too. And so I waited and I listened, or rather, I actually wasn't waiting, I was reading. And I heard his answer, an answer that stunned me because it showed that my hope, regardless of how reasonable it seemed to me, how innocent, hid a diabolical lie. So let me remind you of the hope, the question, right? How often we wish that God would make himself or show himself stronger, that he would strike decisively, defeating evil and creating a better world. And here's the answer. All ideologies of power justify themselves in exactly this way. They justify the destruction of whatever would stand in the way of progress and the liberation of humanity. We suffer on account of God's patience, and yet we need his patience. God, who became a lamb, tells us that the world is saved by the crucified one, not by those who crucified him. The world is redeemed by the patience of God. It is destroyed by the impatience of man. Ideologies of power, the impatience of men. The Pope's answer to my question was to question me, is to question my way of thinking, to conform it to the standard of faith, which is the standard of the crucified one. If I had ears to hear, I would have noticed that he had answered the question already even before he asked it when he said, "It is not power, but love that redeems us. This is God's sign. He himself is love." It was a moment of grace for me because I realized that this refutation of my hope was actually the refutation of a false hope. But it was not a refutation of all hope. It was an invitation to a different, purer, more beautiful hope. One that called not simply on the power of God acting from without, pushing salvation buttons the way creationists often conceive of him pushing creation buttons, but the love of God within, transforming me into one who, like Christ, finds salvation within suffering, who learns compassion and the courage not only to suffer, but to suffer courageously with others. That was surprising to me. I was surprised by an entirely unexpected answer and the grace that it offered me. And it's a grace that has carried me through a number of tragedies since. So surprise, right? But as the Pope would say just a little bit further along in his homily, there is nothing more beautiful than to be surprised by the gospel, by the encounter with Christ. There is nothing more beautiful than to know him and to speak to others of our friendship with him. The task of the shepherd, the task of the fisher of men can often seem wearisome, but it is beautiful and wonderful because it is truly a service to joy, to God's joy which longs to break into the world. And once again, how does God's joy and his love break into the world? Not through power, but through love. But a deeper question remains. When we think about what science has revealed about the universe, everything we now know has only sharpened the problem of evil. Even as it has made modern life so much better, so much easier, so much less painful than it had been in times past. Yesterday we explored God's relationship to his creation and we celebrated the whole universe as a work of divine love. And yet the universe, life, and especially human life, give evidence of imperfections that cause oceans of suffering and death for God's creatures. Right? This is what we call the problem of evil, right? And it seems to call into question that the universe is the product of divine love. And the misery and destruction we see all around lead many to reject the existence of God altogether. It's not a new problem, but modern science has made it even clearer by helping us understand the fragility of all life. In fact, destruction is written into the very fabric of our universe. Our very sun will fizzle out. Our entire universe will expand so far that it will simply whisper away. Good things that exist, and God is the cause of all being, right? That will pass away. So how can we reconcile the doctrine of God the Creator with the presence of evil in creation? In this initiative, we continuously talk about the harmony of faith and reason, and so we can't set that question aside. But we must proceed with caution. Right? In the use of our powers of reason, and this is not just in trying to understand the faith and theology, right? But also in any use of reason, there are two conditions of darkness that can occur. Right? One of them is good and one of them is bad. One condition of darkness is mysteries beyond us that show us reason's inherent limits, right? And the other darkness is contradictions, superficial answers that disturb and injure truth, right? Bad theology sets out to convince by offering simplistic solutions and hiding the deep contradictions those rely on. Good theology sets out in faith, not in coercion, even the coercion of logic, and is not surprised when it must say that no more can be said. The key to avoiding contradiction while embracing mystery is to know both the power of reason and the limits of reason. To go only so far in exploring reality as reality actually permits, to leave the rest to wonder and humble silence, and in this case, to tears. Now, if I'm successful today, I'll resolve some absurdities, hopefully, some contradictions, but I will preserve mystery, because the real answer to the problem of evil is ineffable. It is hidden in the wounded heart of Christ, and it involves seeing the world through the lens of the wounds of Christ. So I will try to do as well as I can, as adequately as I can, three things. First, I want to talk about the problem itself, relying on the thought of St. Augustine and others, facing the paradox of divine creation and evil. Second, I'm going to repeat and address one classical philosophical formulation of the problem. Those of you probably know this already, David Hume, and the way he talked about this dilemma. And try to reframe it in a way that offers the perspective of faith. And then in the end, I want to return to Benedict's answer and share a story that comprises in beauty, but not in explanation, what the meaning of his answer, the one we just listened to, looks like when it is lived. Okay? So let's start with a paradox. It's a tension that cannot be dissolved. From the Catholic perspective, all things, even our thoughts and our own free actions, both have God for the source of their existence and yet also have the capacity for evil. St. Paul recognized the imperfections of creation and spoke of the whole creation groaning in pain. God, creator and source of existence for all things, made real the freedom of the Nazi concentration camp guards, for instance, just as he made real the freedom of Mother Teresa as she gave herself to the poor of Calcutta. 1,500 years ago, St. Augustine expressed this paradox more poignantly than, I think, anyone in literature and writing, reflected upon the evil he found in himself, outside of the Bible, I would say. Who made me? He said. Was it not my God, who is not only good, but goodness itself? Whence came I then to will to do evil, and to be unwilling to do good, that there might be cause for my just punishment? Who was it that put this in me, and implanted in me the root of bitterness, seeing I was altogether made by my most sweet God? Where is evil then, he said, and when did it start, and how has it crept into the world? What is its root, and what is its seed? It would be St. Augustine who would offer to history, I think, a clearer perspective on evil, often referred to rather misleadingly by thinkers as the privation theory of evil. He saw that evil was not a being, and therefore not a subsistent reality, a thing of divine creation. Rather, he said, evil is a lack or absence. It is the privation of a good that should be present. Now, this requires some clarification, because not all absences of good involve evil. A classic example is a rock, which is not able to see, right? But we don't feel compassion for the rock as we do for a blind person or an animal, because it is not in the nature of a mineral to see. Every created nature is finite. Even if a creature has all that is natural to it, it does not have the infinite range of perfections that only belong to God. Interestingly, it was precisely his faith in God as creator of all things that allowed Augustine to conclude that evil, I quote, is not anything found in nature. His insight was formally proclaimed as a doctrine of the Catholic faith by the Council of Florence, that said, this council asserts that there is no nature of evil, because every nature, insofar as it is a nature, is good. The evil that causes us to suffer and creation to groan is not a creature of God. It's not something willed into being by him. It exists precisely when a creature, or in the case of human beings, a thought, word, or free action, lacks something that it ought to possess. God is not the source of evil, although he does permit it. We can generally distinguish with our intellectual tradition, the Catholic intellectual tradition, two kinds of evil. And I say generally, because you could immediately imagine ways in which they would be deeply interconnected. Right? The first kind, physical evil, is evil that does not involve, at least directly, personal fault. Personal fault is sometimes the cause of it, though. So physical blindness is an example. Blindness is the privation, the non-existence of sight in a creature whose nature it is to see. And by see, I'm talking about see with, eyes. Many physical evils occur as a matter of course because of physical good. Cancer happens because mutations that drive evolution, which is good, also drive disease, which has an evil effect. Underwater earthquakes and their tsunamis create human deaths and property destruction, which is evil, because geological processes, which are good, that form beautiful tropical islands, which are good, also deprive the Earth's crust of its stability, which causes evil for creatures whose lives depend upon that stability. The same is true with all biological life. As Aristotle keenly observed, and any modern biologist can confirm, the generation of new life often requires corruption, which literally means destruction. The conception of a new human being requires the corruption of the ovum and sperm, which cease to exist when they combine to form the zygote. Now, we tend to think about the word corruption only in a moral context, right? But that's not what we're using it in a much broader sense here, right? And in order to sustain their lives, animals destroy other living things by consuming them. Hence, the life of the spider, good, is the death of the fly, evil. Anytime we observe or realize an example of physical evil and try to identify it, we discover that it is impossible to find evil until we come to some negative, some absence. The purely positive properties of anything cannot be called evil, even if those positive properties are the cause of evil. For example, what is a deadly virus? Well, it's genetic material in a coating of protein. Okay. What's evil about proteins? What's evil about genetic material? Notice we can't decompose what a virus is and find the evil place, right? The evil thing. The evil of a deadly virus is not any part of it. So what is the evil of the virus? Why do we call it deadly? Because of the privation of health and life it causes. That's the true evil. Consider that the very viruses that may cause sickness can also be directly involved in great good. As it turns out, it seems, or scientists are telling us, that a retrovirus, a kind of virus that inserts its DNA into the cells of other organisms without allowing them to cross the barrier, inserted its DNA into the DNA of our evolutionary ancestors millions of years ago. And what would have normally have meant sickness or perhaps death became the genetic component for the mammalian placenta, upon which all human infants depend in the womb. If the virus were simply evil, right, it could not also then be a cause of good precisely by its very nature, by what it does. That would be a contradiction. The virus is not the evil. As I said, the absence of health and the negation of life it might cause is the true evil. Therefore, the late Jesuit philosopher W. Norris Clark called evil a hole in being. A hole in being. It is the lack of what ought to be present. It's the non-existence of some good that should be there, that by nature should be there. The second and more tragic kind of evil Augustine identified is moral evil. Evil in which rational creatures knowingly and freely deprive their own thoughts, words, and actions of the good that ought to be present within them. And once again, when we look at these, it is the hole within these that make them evil. H-O-L-E, not W-H-O-L-E. Adultery is an example. Its evil does not consist in the bodily pleasure or personal intimacy involved in sexual intercourse. Both of those are good. The evil of adultery is the non-existence of sexual fidelity, where sexual fidelity ought to be present. This lack of loving fidelity to a spouse corrupts the good of adulterous sex from within, rendering adultery or adulterous acts inherently immoral and evil. The evil of the crimes of the Nazis in the concentration camps involved the absence in their thoughts, words, and deeds of the proper respect for the human life and dignity of the Jewish people that they imprisoned, tortured, and killed. The absence of compassion, respect for rights, the absence of truth, the culture of the lie, right? The absence of kindness and justice, that's what made Auschwitz evil. It was not the concrete walls of the gas chambers. It was not the chemical composition of the gases that were used there for horrific purposes. It was what was missing. Now, just as a side note, a little tangent here, but I think an important one. Two realities closely associated with evil are often confused for it, but they actually need special consideration. And this would be physical suffering and emotional suffering. Pain and emotional suffering. The feeling of pain is actually a positive presence, not a privation. It tells us that there is something wrong in our bodies, right? Physical pain. Or emotional suffering, something wrong perhaps within our relationships, our actions, or our attitudes. Sometime about mid-February, right after we had the polar vortex, I realized that all I was doing every day was thinking about how unfortunate it was that I lived in northern Indiana. And I started to get deeply, deeply depressed. Deeply depressed. And I realized, and this was a very hard thing to realize, and I got very angry at God about it. And by the way, if God reveals himself to us, prayer is revealing ourselves to God, right? At least in part. So you should tell God when you're angry with him. And I did, right? I realized that I had to let go of the place that I loved, and I had to try to love it here. And if I didn't try to love it here, I was going to make myself miserable, and I was going to make my wife miserable, and I was going to make my children miserable, and my colleagues miserable. They're miserable already, some of them. But anyway. Kelly would always check on me. How you doing? She's from South Bend. How you doing, Chris? How you making the winter? I would always lie and say I was having a good winter. Okay, anyway. So, but without these important messenger services, we couldn't function. And so they actually aid us. They do not deprive us, right? Many a hand would be irreparably burned if the pain of the fire and heat from the stove burner did not alert that person to its destructive presence. It would be hard to count how many times pain has saved any person's life in this room, right? Even though from the perspective of pleasure, it is never preferable. Good psychological health consists not simply in not ever having any emotional pain, any emotional suffering. It's actually about learning what it's telling you and then learning how to deal positively with it, right? So pain is a rightly ordered response to physical and moral evil. It is not evil in itself. Finally, and this is very important, to call evil a privation is not to say that it's nothing, strictly speaking. It is not to declare it to be non-existent or powerless. It is a lack where something truly ought to be present. It is a real hole in being, right? Real. It is powerfully destructive simply by virtue of what it takes away or what it might disfigure. Physical and moral evil are the source of all suffering for human beings, right? and often in ways unimaginable to us for those who suffer much more deeply than we do. So I hope you could see that this is not simply understanding what we mean by evil, by calling it a privation, is not any resolution of the question that's before us, right? Psalm 34, verse 7 tells us, "The poor one cried out, and the Lord heard, and from all his distress he saved him." Well, if the Lord is the poor one's creator and rescuer, why does he have to cry out in the first place? And why do so many cry out and not receive the rescue that they so desire? That's the problem of evil. Okay, so let's turn back then to our critical question. Why does God, the source of all things, create a universe in which physical evil is actually a part of its functioning, and in which moral evil permeates human life? The classic argument proposed centuries ago by the English philosopher David Hume runs as follows. God by nature, he said, must be both omnipotent, all-powerful, and omnibenevolent, all good. Now, if God is omnipotent, he could prevent all evil. And if he is all good, he would do so, since it is the characteristic of a good person to prevent evil wherever possible. But in fact, he does not prevent all evil, even though he could, but allows a vast amount of it, both physical and moral, as is evident in the world around us. Therefore, it follows that God is either not omnipotent nor omnibenevolent. In either case, such a being could not be God. Therefore, there is no God. It seems almost an insult to those who suffer in a world weighted down with evil to disagree with Hume. Sometimes you feel that way when you're dealing with students who want to reject God because of their suffering, right? If I say, no, God is there, it's almost like I'm insulting them in their suffering. Right? I think there's a better way of answering their suffering than coming up with an argument, by the way, but we'll get to that later. Right? But denying the existence of ultimate goodness is not compassion. Right? It's not compassion. It might help to place Hume, if you want to understand his argument a little better, in its historical context, which, by the way, Steve Barr has helped us with, Karen Uberg has helped us with. It seems like almost everyone has hit this. Hume was deeply influenced, as was the entire period in which he lived, by a mechanistic conception of the universe. The universe is a massive machine, one that he shared with Sir Isaac Newton, who had deeply influenced his philosophy. So for Hume, the great flaw of evil seems to undermine the idea of a divine mechanic, right, or inventor. He's looking for God, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, who creates a flawless machine of which we are a part. But our universe has massive flaws considered as a machine in the evils that we suffer. And so for Hume, evil is proof that this machine has no divine engineer behind it. But engineers do not enter into personal relationships with their creations. They love them as products. They do not love them interpersonally. What if God created the universe for persons? What if what we've said so far is true, that God created the universe out of love, for the sake of love? I think that changes the picture quite radically from Hume. Remember the words of Ratzinger from yesterday. A world created and willed on the risk of freedom and love is no longer just mathematics. As the arena of love, it is also the playground of freedom, and so it incurs the risk of evil. It accepts the mystery of darkness for the sake of the greater light constituted by freedom and love. Hume's argument is wrong, not because he does not make a valid point, but because he's missing some important alternatives that only a personalist perspective, and I think radically a Christian perspective, can offer. A good person is not always obliged to prevent any and every evil. It may be that a good person allows a lesser evil to occur so that a greater good may be achieved through it. As a parent does when they allow their children to suffer failures in order to learn responsible judgment and valuable lessons, without which they would be worse off than not. Right? Harry Potter suffered horribly in those books. But think about what Harry Potter became in those books. In a similar way, when we consider the universe and human life, we realize that the possibility of goodness is deeply reduced and diminished without the possibility of evil. The universe's integrity would be simply annihilated if God were to suspend the stable operation of the many forces and laws that undergird the entire cosmos whenever necessary in order to prevent every physical evil. Think about that stable operation on which the evolution of the universe and of life depends. In that stable operation, it is inevitable that living organisms will occasionally act spontaneously or be acted upon in ways that bring them into conflict with that stable operation, that cause injury, pain, and suffering. Remember, I said already that most physical evils occur because of physical goods. The geological processes that cause beautiful tropical islands and tsunamis that we just talked about. The lion, which is good, could not be a lion unless it killed and consumed the gazelle. That's good for the lion. It's evil for the gazelle. Much of the beauty and majesty of our universe would be missing were God simply to halt every physical evil. The absence of physical evil in the universe really would mean this. It would mean a universe in which life would not freely develop and which everything would operate according to a single static pattern. That would translate into a world in which there would be nothing surprising in nature and in which human beings could never choose to impose their own patterns on things. It would be a world without freedom. It would be a completely regimented world in which we could not have any meaningful activity of our own. That's fine if the universe is just a machine and we are all just cogs in it. It doesn't work if it was created by love and for love. So when we come to the greatest tragedy of all, the moral evil of human beings, we are faced with the same dilemma. There would be no human freedom in a world in which God prevented all moral evil. In such a universe, it would also be the case that human beings acting morally with goodness in mind could accomplish no good freely as real causes of goodness. God would not simply be the absolute source of all things. He would also prevent us from collaborating with him in the fulfillment of his desire to perfect the universe he created, to make moral masterpieces of our own lives. But if he is to enable us to freely cooperate, he has to also enable us to freely choose to reject goodness. And so moral evil has to be allowed if moral goodness is to be possible. We don't want a divine dictator who would destroy our freedom. No one really wants that. We want a heavenly Father who does not violate the universe and human freedom, a God who deals with us in love, not simply in power. Right? We've been using the word love a lot. Let's remind ourselves that we're talking about love as willing the good of another for another's sake. Right? And please put out of your mind ridiculous myths like unconditional love. That's God, right? But I'm talking about in this world, you can't even say I love you except on the condition that you can breathe. If somebody kicks you in the stomach, you won't even be able to say, I love you. You with me? Right? Our love is contingent and conditioned upon all kinds of things. What makes love love is not some weird, unattainable ideal called unconditional love. It's about willing the good of the other as other. We do it imperfectly, right? But hopefully we do it, and in it we find our greatest delight. This is what Pope Benedict was saying in his inaugural homily by showing the unloving totalitarian lie behind the false hope of a universe on which God is constantly pushing salvation buttons. A lie that has been foisted upon human beings and unmasked by ideologies of power like Nazism and Marxism, which promise a better world and caused unbelievable destruction. So what is the answer of faith to Hume's argument? The Christian answer lies precisely in the fact that God's work of creation and redemption is not yet complete. Maybe God does will a perfect world, and he is actively working to bring the universe and history to the perfect completion. In the words of 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 13, what we are waiting for is what the Lord promised. The new heavens and the new earth, the place where righteousness will be at home. From this perspective of faith, we can say to Hume, yes, God is all good and all powerful. And yes, evil is present in vast amounts. Therefore, not there is no God. Therefore, God will defeat all evil. Indeed, he is already powerfully and mysteriously doing so by enabling his creatures to be themselves and mercifully forgiving them when they fail, working through holy men and women to transform the world through their free cooperation with him. God would not allow any evil unless he could and would bring some greater good from it. This free cooperation in the transformation of the universe does not come simply from good intentions shared among a few. It comes from the loving sacrifice that God took upon himself when he became a human being in order to accomplish our liberation from evil, sin, and death. The ultimate answer that God gives to our question is the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. First, in his life, Christ overcame moral evil in himself by being the perfect example of the fullness of human goodness with no moral evil whatsoever. In the words of sacred scripture, Jesus, the high priest, who offered himself in sacrifice for our sins, as it says in Hebrews, is not, quote, unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Next, in his sacrifice on the cross, Jesus overcame moral evil not only in himself, but in all human beings, past, present, and future, by becoming an inexhaustible source of forgiveness to those who have sinned, and by becoming the one who reconciles all human beings to each other and to God. And finally, through the miracle of his resurrection, Christ overcame all physical evil and took our human nature into an indestructible life, preparing the coming of a new creation, a new heavens and earth with no evil whatsoever. This is why St. Paul calls the risen Christ the firstborn of many brothers and sisters. Excuse me. I need to get some water. St. Paul calls the risen Christ the firstborn of many brothers and sisters because he offers us a way to join him, body and soul, in a universe to come that is perfectly fulfilled and transformed into the kingdom of God. This is why, after the consecration of Mass, when Christ is truly present, right? When the great symbol becomes reality, body, blood, soul, and divinity, we sing, "Save us, Savior of the world, for by your cross and resurrection you have set us free. By his cross, all moral evil is overcome. By his resurrection, all physical evil is brought to its end." Right? Remember the beautiful image in the book of Revelation, right? Where death itself is led to the lake of fire. The last enemy to be destroyed is death, right? Okay. This is not something that we can fully see. I hope this has been clear, just simply by reason unaided by faith. And nothing I've said now reduces the sting of the suffering that evil causes. Evil will always attend the world until it is fulfilled, and the way to endure it, even to conquer it, can only be to walk daily with Christ crucified and risen, suffering as he did patiently out of love, recognizing that everyone's suffering is precious to God, not because he wishes us to suffer, but because such love is his own attitude to our universe, a love that overcomes all evil from within. Through loving God and loving like God, our suffering in the face of evil and through evil is transformed into sacrifice. Right? We tend to associate that word with misery, right? But it's not misery. It's the joy-filled hope that in response to the cry of the poor, the Lord will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or mourning, wailing, or pain, right? In the new creation where God will be all in all. I want to end by offering an example of that kind of cruciform life, which hopes for the conquest of all evil, but refuses to pretend that it isn't there. Right? Now, in this regard, let me just stop and give you an ad for a book I read 2 weeks ago by Kate Bowler, who is a professor at Duke Divinity School and who is terminally ill with stage 4 cancer. And the book is called "Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved." That is a fantastic book. It's a marvelous book. I strongly recommend that you read it. By the way, this is not a woman who is rejecting God when she rejects the idea that everything happens for a reason. She's rejecting bad theology. She's rejecting superficial answers, right? That do not really call people to love. But you get to sit at the side of somebody's hospital bed and assure them of that so you can go home feeling better, right? I want to end by offering an example of this cruciform kind of life, which hopes for the conquest of all evil but refuses to pretend it isn't there. It's the example of this man here on the left of the screen, Francois Mauriac, the French Catholic novelist, and an encounter he had with a young journalist in 1954, the man on the right. The journalist had come from Tel Aviv to interview him on behalf of a daily newspaper. At first, Mauriac was reluctant, but the journalist, he said, quote, won me over from the first moment. Mauriac opened up, and at one point, Mauriac spontaneously shared about something he never witnessed, but his wife did. Her memory of cattle cars filled with Jewish children. Noting that at the time of the interview, he's noting, as he's later, right, that even at that time as he's talking to the young man, no one knew about the Nazi extermination methods. The world knew that they had killed many, they didn't know how. Right? Mauriac exclaimed, I have thought of these children so many times. And the journalist said, I was one of them. I have no words that can match Mauriac's response to this revelation, so I'm going to let him speak. He was one of them. He had seen his mother, his beloved little sister, and most of his family, except his father and 2 other sisters, disappear in a furnace fueled by living creatures. The child who tells us his story was one of God's chosen. From the time he began to think, he lived only for God, studying the Talmud, wholly dedicated to the Almighty. Have we, and it's hard to talk about this year in the Catholic Church, have we ever considered the consequence of a less visible, less striking abomination, yet the worst of all, for those of us who have faith, the death of God in the soul of a child who suddenly faces absolute evil? Let us try to imagine what goes on in his mind, right, as he watches rings of black smoke unfurling in the sky, smoke emanating from the furnaces into which his little sister and his mother have been thrown after thousands of other victims. And then he gives us the journalist's own words. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, that turned my life into one long night 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget that nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. The name of the young journalist was Elie Wiesel. And thanks to the support of Mauriac, the story of this young journalist, his memoirs of Auschwitz, that he entitled Night, would forever change the world's understanding of the Holocaust. Night is the story of the true cry of faith, narrated as the loss of faith. Consider the darkest moment of the torment Wiesel suffered, as summarized by Mauriac and completed by Wiesel. Mauriac says, when the child witnessed the hanging, yes, of another child, who, he tells us, had the face of a sad angel. He heard someone behind him groan, for God's sake, where is God? And this is Wiesel's response. And from within me, I heard a voice answer, where is he? This is where, hanging here from this gallows. I won't share any more of Wiesel's words because they must be read and contemplated in seriousness and in silence and in prayer and weeping. But I do want to share Mauriac's response, which is given in the foreword of the book Night, upon hearing the journalist's testament that day, because his response embodies the true Christian response to evil, a response that does not explain away its hideousness, but does show us the undying hope that God suffers with us and is on the side of the victim, that God, who created all things, can and will, and in mystery already has, in the suffering of his Son, defeated all evil. Although we are not permitted to taste that victory in any way except in the trust of faith, the anticipation of hope, and the foretaste that self-giving love, mercy, and compassion gives us. Here's what Mauriac says. And I, who believe that God is love. What answer was there to give my young interlocutor, whose dark eyes still held the reflection of the angelic sadness that appeared one day on the face of a hanged child? What did I say to him? Did I speak to him of that other Jew, that crucified brother who perhaps resembled him and whose cross conquered the world? Did I explain to him that what would have been a stumbling block for his faith had become a cornerstone for mine? And that the connection between the cross and human suffering remains, in my view, the key to the unfathomable mystery in which the faith of his childhood was lost. And yet, Mauriac says, Zion has risen up again out of the crematoria and slaughterhouses. The Jewish nation has been resurrected from among its thousands of dead. It is they who have given it new life. We do not know the worth of one single drop of blood, one single tear. All is grace. If the Almighty is the Almighty, the last word for each of us belongs to him. That is what I should have said to the Jewish child. But all I could do was embrace him and weep. And by embracing him and weeping, he said it all. He said it with his body, with his arms, with his sobs and his tears. He said more than words could say. And so I'm not going to say any more and let Scripture say the rest. Revelation chapter 21, verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The former heaven and the former earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I also saw the holy city, a new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, God's dwelling is with the human race. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will always be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. And there shall be no more death or mourning, wailing or pain, for the old order has passed away." And the one who sat on the throne said, "Behold, I make all things new." Amen. We have time for some questions. Yeah. Before we answer any questions, why don't we stop and say a prayer for all of those who suffer? When I teach my classes, I always take various intentions, but then I also say, let's remember all those who are most in need of God's help and all those who are most in need of God's mercy. And then let us in our minds and hearts place ourselves beside them. Right? Well, let's do that now. Dear Lord, in faith we believe that you will wipe every tear away from every eye. We ask you to let us carry that hope into the world in ways more eloquent than words. Through the power of your love transforming our own hearts and forgiving us, let us become living witnesses to your conquest of all evil. We pray this in your name, Lord Jesus. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Brother, yes.
Thank you very much for the powerful theological explanations. One of the biggest challenge that faces me every day in my school is watching young kids with all kinds of disability and watching them die. As a matter of fact, one of our kids died last week. He just turned 18 and he died in his sleep. Sometimes when the other kids come to class, they ask, why are we like this? Why did this guy have to die? You know, it's difficult to give them a straight answer. And each time they say that, I just said, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe someday we will know. I don't know. I don't know if you have another something you think can be said
No, you just said it.
to.
That's the first thing that should always be said in the context of your loving presence. I don't know why this is happening. I wish I could make it different. I wish I could make it stop. I can't. But I'll be with you.
Right.
And you are, right? That's what you're doing there.
Yeah, it's very challenging, you know.
Yeah, I know. And, all of us, right, have this, many of us with our own children, lots of us, every one of us with our students, right? And it's precisely being willing to enter in and to become an artist of empathy, right? In which you are not afraid to offer yourself, in which you learn the art of offering yourself in such a way that it's helpful, right? Helpful in the deepest sense of the word, not just, like bringing a meal or something like that, but actually being present with another person and being willing to journey with them in it, right? I think that is the answer, right? When you read the book of Job, right, and Job's protest against God, right, the deepest thing that stands out to me is that God speaks to Job. And after he hears God basically tell him, you're not capable of understanding the answer, right, for chapters and chapters, right? Job says, right, now I have seen him. Now I have seen him, and I repent in sackcloth and ashes, right, for his rejection of what God had allowed to happen, right? It's God seeing, it's people who are in suffering seeing God in the face of those who are members of his body and who love them as he does. So that's about the best I've got.
I wrote my HTB thesis on the theology of suffering, actually, and at the moment I was going through a lot of pains myself and a loss in my family. I just lost two of my uncles, my very close uncles, when I was graduating. So that's part of my reflection. Is difficult to really explain what is happening. And in my reflection, I discovered that suffering in itself is evil. Like you said, physical suffering, absence, the privation of a certain good is evil. But in each suffering, we can somehow draw out some goodness
Yes.
from our attitude or how we respond to that particular experience of suffering. Now, sometimes when I'm on my own, this might sound judgmental, but when I look around and I see what is happening on TV, especially one day I saw a program of some pregnant women taking all kinds of, what is that thing called? Cannabis? Is it cannabis?
Marijuana?
Yeah. So they're taking marijuana and they form a community to support each other to end the stigma about marijuana for married people, for pregnant people or nursing mothers. And I think about how dangerous such kind of substance is for someone who is healthy, an adult. How much more for an infant, for a baby in the womb. So sometimes I tend to want to be judgmental to say, why do people make certain decisions when they are pregnant and somehow it affect the innocent child who is later born with all kinds of disability or disease or the other that I have never heard about. So I don't know how this message can be, as teachers, when we teach people in class, especially our seniors and those in high school, is there a way to incite some of these moral teachings, practical moral teachings about these things, so that when these kids grow up or they go out of school, they begin to become sexually active people. They become aware of certain decisions they make can affect their fetus. And given there are some people who are born with disability, even without our own participation. But what I've seen is that oftentimes it's like some people want it because of some government benefit they get to take care of the kid. Well, this guy who died is a pathetic story. I don't want to go into the whole story about the family and everything, and it's so painful, and this is just expressing my sadness about some of this reality of evil in our society.
Well, it's important. It's important. Am I still on? It's important that we. I'm sorry. It's important that we talk about these things openly. Part of the problem with our culture is it's a throwaway culture. We don't want to look at suffering. So we put it to the ban, and we have ways to do that, right? The possibility of death makes us think about the meaning of our own existence, but we don't like thinking about that. So we make death something handled by, well, he was Joseph Ratzinger when he put it this way, technologically handled by technical people, right? And they take care of all the death stuff. That gets out of our way, and we don't see it, right? I had the benefit of growing up in a family where my grandmother had 10 brothers and sisters. So I spent my childhood going to funerals. And it was good for me. It was good for me to see that, right? It's good for children to understand that and to talk about that and to learn about that. And it's good for people to see that suffering is real, right? And that we don't allow ourselves to live in this bubble, this self-enclosed bubble in which we don't let that affect us. And so we can't, right? We can't. Because if we went there, we would find the good that this situation might have produced. And we begin to question what we really think is good. So I'll end there, but thank you. Yes?
Well, I will admit I got slightly sidetracked by this picture.
Yeah.
Being Franciscan and from a Franciscan school, our image is the San Damiano cross, and it has the picture of the penis on the stomach. And I was looking at this. Mm-hmm. Was that a representation of that in this picture of the creation, the representation of the creation, or was it just the image that I'm looking at?
It's actually by a very strange French artist named Jacques Tissot, but I love his paintings, so I use them a lot in PowerPoints because they just seem to capture something. I like this one particularly because Christ's wounds are glowing. And so in context of what we were talking about, I thought that was something that said more than my words could say. They're suffused with light.
I have sort of like a bring it back to, you mentioned that book, and that was resonating with me even before you said that, because I get very frustrated. We've had a lot of trauma in our school just in general based on our student population. And their response in retreats, in life and everything, everything happens for a reason. Everything happens for a reason. You just don't know yet, but everything happens for a reason. And they're saying this to each other, and I don't ever want to step in and be like, please stop saying that. Right. But I don't know how to address that as like I don't want to say glib answer, because they really are trying to help that other person through their suffering by saying that. But
well, here's the thing. So I want to justify that answer a little bit, and I thought I had put this in my presentation, but I didn't. So I'm glad you brought it up. Everything happens for a reason is insufficient, because if what we're saying about evil is true, and I think it is, that evil is a privation of what ought to be present. Evil is not something intelligible. Right? A nothing is not intelligible. It's only understandable by reference to that which ought to be present but is not, but is somehow tragically missing. You with me? And so To say everything happens for a reason gives the impression that somehow this is inflicted on this person. You know what I mean? For some cool thing that's going to come out of it. And then you should just roll with it, baby. No. No, if we believe that God is the source of all being, and we do, and all being is good, right? Then we have to look at evil as, we can't look at it for what it is. It isn't, right? But it is a real isn't. I mean, that's paradoxical and difficult to talk about. And so to respond to it with anything, everything happens for, all that becomes superficial, right? It becomes, I know what people are trying to get at. What they're trying to say is that God's plan is
God
not
is a plan.
defeated
Yeah,
by
right.
this.
Yeah, right.
But maybe you should
that's
say
where
that.
they always come back to is
Right.
if I say like, let's maybe find a different way to say everything
Yeah.
happens for a reason. I don't think that's really what you meant. I think what you meant is that God has a plan that we can't see, or
Right.
But then that's still, they feel like it's me saying.
Yeah, I wouldn't even go there. I would
Yeah.
find a way to make sure it doesn't end up with everything happens for a reason. God's plan has not been defeated by this. God's love for you is not defeated by this. And then to show it to them.
I'm going to do two, sorry, since
Okay.
I have the microphone. The other
Good.
one is I've discovered a lot in teaching moral theology and in social justice, kind of society in general, but the students as well, the desire to totally eliminate suffering. I mean, it wasn't how, I was raised so much with my mom, everything we did was like, offer it up, poor souls in purgatory, offer it up. We offered it up for everybody. But they don't have that vocabulary. They don't have that mindset. They don't have, and so it's very hard. And I feel like I'm in a trapped situation where if I say like, guys, we cannot I did it this year. I said, we cannot completely eliminate suffering. That is impossible. It's impossible to completely eliminate suffering. So if we're making our whole goal eliminating suffering, then we're defeating ourselves before we start. And I'm saying this like over top of a girl who just lost her mother. And then it like hits me like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? But I don't know how to address that, I guess, with them.
Yeah, well, okay, so first of all, just let's go back to what we talked about. And I'm going to, by the way, this is going to go up in the resource thing, the transcript. But also, in the Foundation's New Orleans 2019 reader, I have an essay called Evil, Prayer, Miracles, Questions for God, right, from Science and Religion. And so much of what I've shared with you today is from that chapter, but the other two parts, prayer and miracles, and how they relate to this question of evil is important, right? But remember, defeating all suffering. We talked about suffering is not an evil in itself, right? So when you're defeating suffering, you haven't yet even scratched at evil. Like you haven't even taken a swipe at it. You see what I'm saying? You may have relieved a person's experience of a certain evil, right? So I drank too much last night. I got a hangover. Now I take some ibuprofen and drink a lot of water, and I've relieved some suffering, right? But maybe I've been doing this every night, and quite honestly, every lunch. And well, honestly, right? Have I defeated the evil by getting rid of the hangover? No, there's a problem. I've got a problem, right? By the way, I'm not an alcoholic. I'm just speaking.
I probably won't use that with high school students.
I'm speaking hypothetically. Right, but you get the idea. Okay, we're going to be taking a break at 3 o'clock. Claire, you guys are on at 3:15. Okay, good. So I just wanted to. So we've got a little bit more time for a couple more questions. Yes, sir.
You said in your talk that pain can't be considered a privation because it positively alerts us to something being off.
Yeah.
That seems, at the very least, to be scandalous to pious imagination when we consider the Garden of Eden or whatever original justice was for Adam and Eve. So, considering that logic, would Adam and Eve have felt pain in the Garden of Eden?
Yes. I will greatly intensify the pains of your childbearing.
Right, but that seems
now
to be
all of a sudden. Now watch this, lady. Ouch. No. Right. No. First of all, I'm going to talk about this in my next talk on Thursday when I talk about human origins. But preternatural innocence and gifts would not mean that human beings, I won't speak to this directly, so I'm glad you brought it up now, would mean that they would not have challenges, not have to strive, not have to sacrifice, right? Right? We don't know exactly what it would be like. We just don't, right? But the point is that to think about the world as being like this giant, marshmallow cloud, and you know what I mean, and then all of a sudden we sin, and then all of a sudden there's things that can bite us, and all that. Well, yeah, it doesn't make any sense, right? So no, that's not the so it's not like they wouldn't have had nerve endings had they never sinned, right? Yeah. It's a nice meditation on that is the second, and the problem with this book is that it is the worst start to any novel by C.S. Lewis. It's like 50, 60 pages that you've got to literally drag yourself through. But the second book of his science fiction trilogy, Perelandra, there's an interesting reflection on preternaturality in that book, and the creatures he encounters on a different planet who have not fallen, who have not sinned. Very interesting to learn about what they experience. And yeah, it's a fantastic book.
I have a thought, but I haven't completely formulated the question yet. So maybe you can help me get there. But you were talking about suffering, and you said that everyone's suffering is precious to God, which doesn't mean that God wills us to suffer, but this suffering can be transformed into sacrifice. And I was connecting that with the same phrase of, offer it up into sacrifice. Yeah. But it seems like this transformation of suffering into sacrifice isn't necessarily something that is solitary, like is something that we can do ourselves, right, but is something that is a cooperation that we do with God.
Yes.
So it's something that maybe we have to be open to,
right,
in offering it up, but isn't necessarily something like, it's
right,
still something that God is doing in us.
Right. We're filling out the sufferings of Christ, St. Paul says. And I'm going to talk, I've left some loose ends because in my final talk I'm going to try to return to this particular one, as well as some others.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we have time maybe, well, let me see. Just want to make sure. All right, we only have 2 minutes, so if you have a short one, we can do that, and then we'll take a break for 15 minutes. Good, we'll take a break for 17 minutes then. But everybody be back here at 3:15, so thank you very much.